Angela, do you, I have a question actually. If everybody's okay with me asking questions, is that good? Okay, cool. So I really resonated with what all of you were saying. Madison, I believe, said something about how like those messages get co-opted, and Sarah, you explained that in or you showed those examples in your presentation of like how culture, like specific cultural messages kind of intertwine with our resistance, for lack of a better word. But we also see things like, musicians and rappers getting involved with or like performing at the DNC, or using music in these, or art in general, in these ways that like it's almost like the structure is taking the power away, if that makes sense. So how do we prevent um, that co-option? How do we prevent these like more radical messages? Like, I say radical, but everyone deserves a place to live is not that radical. So how do we cut through like corporate co-option of these things through art?
I'd like to piggyback off of that, if that's okay.
Yeah, go on ahead.
I like the idea of stepping into those spaces and kind of looking around and seeing what people are actually talking about. Because if we break it down to what they're talking about rather than their ideologies, the policies, the fact that all of their jobs are leaving, and West Virginia in particular, their Democratic Senator, Joe Manchin, keeps voting to do those things. So again, I think the partisanship is very dangerous. And I think that both parties, the major political parties, have realized that this cultural war chest is something that's very effective in directly communicating whatever, religion, ideas, counter ideas, things that to hate, things to love. I think that it's very, very important that we analyze the art as a form of propaganda and come up with these to effectively combat and almost disarm that propaganda more effectively. When I'm thinking about Hillary Clinton pulling hot sauce out of her bag, yes, exactly, after Formation came out. Yes, we just had at the DNC convention, Billie Eilish, one of the biggest pop stars in the world, coming on and basically advocating for the things that people don't want. I mean, that's essentially what they're doing. They've done this for a long time. Stevie Wonder did it with Bill Clinton. So they realize that this is a powerful, powerful tool. I think that's why they're jumping on all of these mediums to kind of try and keep them in their war chest. Republicans have leaned on country music as a huge, I don't want to say issue, but it is. It's become an issue. We look back a couple of decades, and folk music, which is bluegrass and all that kind of thing, is the original country music, was not about these same topics. So I think that they've realized how powerful arts are, and I think it's important to not only look at the way taking away its liberatory power. Exactly. I think not only looking at the way that we create our art, but also looking at other people's art and saying, well, wait a minute, you're not standing on the principles that artists have agreed, such as anti-war, is essential. Period. There's no arguing whether or not war propaganda is propaganda. There's no argument as to why we should be killing people across the globe. So that's my 2 cents. I have a question that I can kind of put on you guys. In your respective mediums, what let me ask how I can ask this effectively. What are some ways that you've noticed, Marie? You were talking about notation being an accessibility issue. There's a fine line between people who can read notation, which I could read by the way, and there was a lot of octaves and very traditional, and people that can't. How do they use these kinds of? Somebody mentioned the white racial frame as almost a form of gatekeeping into specific ideas being noticed as high art. How have you noticed your mediums doing those kinds of things as almost a form of propaganda?
I guess like the most obvious example for film would be in regards to, because I think film, especially this day and age, is a quite accessible medium because a lot of us have devices, and I'm not saying everyone, of course, but versus 25 years ago where you needed an actual analog camera, a lot of us now have devices where we can express ourselves and we can distribute the art that we create. But if you're talking in a sense in like mainstream pictures, where I think like I think is where the change really needs to happen. You have something like the Oscars, which should be abolished, but you have like Oscars So White, right? And you have these like big production companies that are still stuck in like 1920, and they still only really want they want like people of color, but only as like a token, right? So they can have like someone in a category at the Oscars and be like, oh look, we're so diverse, you know? So I think maybe we like in film especially, you have these huge institutions that still run a lot of stuff. And someone said class distinction. I think that would be a big part of it. Also nepotism too. The film industry is full of nepotism, and any industry is, of course. But it's like when I was in film school, I was like, oh my god, I can't wait to go to the Oscars. And now it's like, okay, I'm not a Coppola, so I'm not gonna make it, you know. And I think that's a big problem as well.
Yeah, in my area, classical music, I think obviously there's huge just cost boundaries to getting into music, but I studied as a vocalist, and I think you'd find in many music schools the voice studio is going to be the most diverse because you don't need all that money to buy a piano. Um, yeah, Laura and vocalists were rad. But then once you get to the professional level, it becomes so much less diverse, and you'll find that in a lot of situations, to really make your way in that area, you have to basically be self-funded. No serious opera companies are going to take someone under about 25 years old for legitimate reasons, partly like not harming your voice, but also that creates an issue where like so many opera singers have advanced degrees, and that's because they need something to do until they can make it properly. And so many of the smaller companies, they want diverse people, but they can't pay them. So that's not helping anyone. So yeah, lowering cost barriers is honestly just the most pragmatic thing in my area.
Puppetry, I think, is kind of an interesting space because it's considered unimportant and not high art, and for children mostly. And because of that, there's a huge lack of research. It's one of those things that, when you look at old recipes and nobody tells you like how to make the basic dough before you start the recipe, because it's just in knowledge that's been passed down. Like there's a lack of like knowledge of early puppetry because it was just something that happened culturally. So on one hand, puppetry is already considered lowbrow, but then of course you have like very high art and high technical puppetry, like marionette puppetry, that's very prized, especially in European countries. So there is like a kind of a class system in puppetry, but let me see what yeah, so a lot of people think about hand puppets. They think about the Muppets and they think about Lambert. But Peter Schumann, the founder of Bread and Puppet Theater, talks about the fact that puppetry is a very important vehicle for political seditious art because people don't take it seriously. Literally, like, it escapes censorship because people are like, oh, whatever, puppetry, we don't care what they're saying. They can say, oh, it's the same philosophy that the Gorilla Girls use, which is you won't believe what comes out of your mouth when you're wearing a gorilla mask. This idea of we're saying what we need to say, but we're hiding behind something that makes us look a little ridiculous, and therefore we can escape censorship or escape notice or not be critiqued as serious. And I think it's important to have a certain accessibility of these messages. And if it's a puppet show, I also would say that puppetry is linked to the kinds of like art that was done in festivals in Europe where you could criticize the king and not be in trouble because it was in a puppet show. So there's a long tradition of puppets saying and criticizing power. And I'm all about the puppets. So
that is so cool. I love the idea of like getting around the powerful and by using all of these different tools that might on their surface look innocent, I guess, for lack of a better word, like, oh, just puppets, but like really doing all this incredible work like in the actual streets. So cool. If we have about 5 minutes, I would love to ask a final question if that's okay. Do any of our other guests have questions?
One quick thing. Somebody asked to drop the names of the things that I presented. I'm just going to throw that in the chat, as well as some ideas to look into. If you all have some other ones, just like some hashtags and stuff, please put them in there as well. These are just things that I came up with.
Contact info, anything you all would like to put in the chat, that would be great. But my final question is, what can we as creators, as artists, do to kind of bridge the gap between our work and like kind of take it out of the ivory tower and into our communities and like creating change in our communities?
I think the idea of subversion is a great place to start. Just what are the small ways that we can get these messages across, especially in the ideas that are a lot more with a lot more pushback in society right now. I really like that idea.